Okay, in this video I'm going to show you guys how you can light a scene in Renderman. So I'm going to be not recreating this. I have the lights in here. I set this up earlier, but it's going to take too long to try to recreate everything from scratch and if you guys watch it. But I'm going to go ahead and talk to you guys about how I would approach lighting this and also go over different Renderman lights. So what I'm using is this is one of my models, and then this is the Pixar Pups environment, just because I wanted an environment to work with. I don't really actually have any materials, so that's something we'll talk about pretty early on after we talk about the initial lights in Renderman, is importance of materials and interaction of lights with materials. Ideally, you guys want to have at least materials, if not textures, on everything in your environment when you light, because it's going to change your lighting so much if something is a very dark value versus something being a very light value. And also if something's reflective or not reflective. You need to get all that figured out, or at least have a starting pass on it before you start lighting, because it's just going to change your work so much. Okay, so in this scene, what I have is I have a two-panel setup. In one panel, so I just click on two-panel setup right here. One panel, I've set it to my render camera. So this is, let's say it's my shot one. So this is set to shot one camera, and then over here is my perspective. And so this one right here, I'm going to overlay image tool. If you get confused at all about any of the image tool stuff or using Renderman, go back and watch any of the Renderman videos that we've posted before, including one I've created, to understand how Renderman works. I'm not going to go into that necessarily. We just want to focus on the lights. But I'm going to overlay my image tool or my render viewer right here on top of this. And I'm also going to have that accessible, so I can click on this. When I click on render, it's going to render from that camera, because otherwise it'll accidentally render from this camera once in a while, which is really annoying. Okay, and then the other thing is, so I just want to make sure I have shot one camera. Let's go ahead and we'll just start with creating some lights. So I'll go ahead and start an IPR render. I'll click on that window with my render camera set up, click IPR. And then image tool pop up if it hasn't already for you, and we're just going to overlay right here. I already have Renderman lights in my file somewhere, so it makes my scene black. If you don't have any Renderman lights at all, you're going to get Maya's default lighting. And so it'll look like there's light sources in here, but they'll disappear as soon as you start adding in Maya lights. So when it comes to this Renderman tab, I'm going to right click here. We're primarily just going to be working with the light tab and the Pixar Dome light tab. We have some of these other ones that I'll talk about a little bit when they're relevant, but we're just going to start with the primary lights. So we're going to go right click on here, and I'm going to go ahead and do either a rectangle or disk light for most of my lights. We'll also talk about distant light, and I've also gone over this in another video, I'm realizing. But we're mostly going to be using our rectangle light and our disk light for most of our light sources that are not the sun or the moon. And then we'll use a Pixar distant light for something like the sun or the moon, a really, really far away distant light. So to place a light, all I have to do is just go in here and left click on one of these light sources. I'm going to start with a rectangle light. So move it in. By default, it's going to place it in the center of your scene, and you're going to have to move it around into position. And then once I scale it up, you'll start to see it starts to reveal itself and light itself, because by default, depending on the scale of your scene, the light source is going to be a little too dim, and so you're going to have to adjust the exposure, change the size in order to start seeing it. So all of my typical transform movement controls work with this. So if I wanted to put this from, right now it's on his left side, or her light, there's no real gender to this character, their left side pointing at them, right? If I wanted to move it over to the right side pointing at them, what I'd have to do is, I'd have to move it over here and then rotate it, right? Which is pretty, I'll do that 95% of the time. Sometimes it's annoying to have to start a light in the middle of a scene and then move it out and rotate it. There's an option in here that you can turn on auto place lights. And what it's going to do is, depending on what you have selected, it's actually going to automatically move the light source to that object. So if I wanted to have a light source starting from, let's say, well, it also, I think it depends on the pivot point of the object. So let's say I wanted to have a light source that started on the desk, right? Because I'm going to start lighting the desk. It might be easier to turn on auto place, click on that button, and now you'll see the light sources actually starts already over here, which makes things a lot faster. I can also select my render camera, which is right here, and I can go and right click and say Pixar Rect Light, and you'll see it places that light source right on the camera. So I don't always use this that much, but it might be helpful if you find adding new lights and placing them really tedious. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add a rect light again. So the rect light and the disk light are going to be the exact same light source or type of light. The only difference is their shape is different. So let's go ahead and scale this up. So I'm just going to place this. If I look at this, the arrow is saying what it's pointing at or what's being illuminated by the light source. Anything behind it is not going to be hit by the light source directly. And everything that is essentially, like you can imagine drawing out, extending this line or this boundary of this square into infinity, and everything that's on this side of that square is going to be lit, and everything behind it's not going to be lit. So it's also casting light this way as well as right in front of it. So open up the attribute editor to see the settings for this. So we have quite a few settings, and we're going to start with the basics. So intensity and exposure are going to change the amount of energy that the light puts out. They both kind of do the same thing for the most part. They just change the intensity of the light or the energy of the light at different scales. So I like to use exposure for actually changing the intensity of my light. So let's say I want to bring this up to, I just want to get this bright enough so my character is starting to be illuminated. Right. I could also increase my brightness of my light by changing the intensity, but exposure is going to increase the brightness much faster. And the reason why I personally like to use exposure instead of intensity is I like to sometimes turn my lights off without having to hide them, right? And by doing that, I like to use this as like an on-off switch, the intensity. So I press 0 to turn it off and press 1 to turn it back on. I don't want to have to take my actually manually adjusted energy level or brightness that I did with my exposure to 0, because then I have to remember, oh crap, what was the value I set for that again? It's like 5.6, right? So this makes it easy to turn on and off while keeping your original value. And you can go past these initial values. So if this is like far away, and let's turn it back towards the character, I can crank it up to 10. It's probably going to be bright enough. But if it's sufficiently far away enough, right? So let's say it's going to be a really far away light source, right? You can go past these values. So let's say I'm going to set it to like 12. There we go. And there we go. We can push it past the limits that initially sets. Color is just going to be the saturation of the light, right? What wavelengths of light, or what color wavelengths are coming out of the light source. And so it does exactly what you think it would do. You have to be careful doing this because it can feel a little too kooky or clown-like or sickly if you just give everything a brightly saturated color. It's nice to try to work with physically plausible colors when you can, and not saturate the light too much and going too saturated, because these are kind of hard to work with in my opinion. But generally speaking, I usually keep that desaturated most of the time. A color map is if you want to actually attach a texture to it, and so it'll change, because this is a square, right? And so each point on this square is like a light source, or it's emitting light from that direction as well. It's not just from single point space. Every point on this square is also emitting light. So you can actually attach a texture map to it, and then it can actually emit different colored light from different parts of the light source. Which I usually don't do that much, but it's something if you want to add like a filter or something over it, like it's emitting through a particular shape or texture, you can do that. And then map gamma is just going to be an adjustment for that texture, and map saturation is just going to also be a color adjustment for that texture, whether you want it to actually have texture to it or if you want it to not. Enable temperature is going to be letting you adjust the color of the light source in a more physically accurate way, reflective of how we measure light temperature and light colors in real life. So if you look up a color temperature chart, you can see that there's certain values, or this temperature in Kelvin, that is associated with particular colors. And there's also, if you're trying to simulate certain types of lights, whether you're doing like a candle light or tungsten light or early sunrise or some kind of incandescent bulb, or the blue of the sky, there's these numbers associated with it. So it's this chart from cool blue to warm red, and that's what that number is. And so this is a little bit more physically plausible, or something that we more encounter on a regular day-to-day basis until you have like colored light filters. So you can enable temperature, and you can change it in here. By default, let's go ahead and bring back up IPR. By default, this 6500 is going to be pretty close to a white. You can see it's a little reddish, so it's not quite desaturated. And you'll see as I bring it lower, right, that left-hand side of that scale, when we're looking at it, goes from orange into the red, right? And then anything higher than that 6500 is going to go towards a saturated blue color. So you can use this to kind of represent like a real life lighting source, whether you want it to be like an incandescent bulb or the sun or the sky or a candle. This is really handy. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off for now. This is a completely desaturated light now. I'm going to go ahead and turn on primary visibility. What this does is you won't notice it at first. Let me go ahead. I'm going to duplicate this light. So we'll come here, duplicate. I'm going to go ahead and move this into the scene. We'll rotate it back towards the character. Let's see. And then I'm going to go ahead and push this back. So we'll move that backwards behind him or her. And then I'll go ahead and tilt it down towards him. And it's probably way too bright, more bright than it needs to be. So let's just go ahead and drop this exposure down. There we go. So let's say we wanted to get a light right there. In this case, by default, it's turned off, which is great because we don't want to see the light source. But if you turn on primary visibility, your light source will actually be viewed in the render, or visible in the render. So let's say if I actually wanted like a desk lamp or a ceiling lamp to be right here, and I wanted to use this inside of it, you could use this to actually make it look like a bulb, or the surface is actually emitting light. Those are the main settings for it. Let's go ahead and I'm going to delete that light for now. I'm going to come back to my primary key light that I'm kind of playing on with right now. Let's go down into the Refine tab. Inside of here, let's go ahead and pull it back. I want to move this light source closer again, and we're probably going to have to bring the exposure down. Let's bring this down a bit. All right. So under the Refine tab, actually before we do that, let's go ahead and try to recreate some of the stuff that I was talking about in my lighting lecture about shadow and light quality. So in order to do this, remember if you've watched my lighting lecture, the shadow or light quality can be described as either soft or hard, and that's based on how hard or soft the edges or the transitions are of your shadows. Right now this is a relatively hard light source because all of my shadows are pretty sharp and crisp, and there's a high contrast between the light side and the shadow side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and play with this scale. But we'll have to make some adjustments, and I'll show you a setting that's going to make this easier. But you'll notice, let's go ahead and I'm going to come in here and go to Command Snapshot so that I can save a version of this while IPR is running. And when I scale, I'm going to scale this up really large, and we're going to go ahead and bring the exposure down because this, by default, the size of the lights in Renderman are also going to change the brightness or intensity or energy of them. So you can see here, right, look at the difference. Let me go ahead and pull the exposure up just a touch. Ooh, not that much. You can see exposure can jump really quickly. Let's set that to like 4.25. Okay. Okay. So you can see, once this cleans up a little bit, watch this shadow right here and also this shadow right here. That light, or the shadow, becomes a lot softer as that light source gets bigger, right? Which creates a softer feeling of the light, right? The shadows get softer, and so the light feels a little bit softer. This isn't an amazing example, so I'd probably have to, let's try to crank this up a little bit higher. This is really big, and maybe let's pull this a little bit more towards the side, because it's just going to kind of flatten them completely out. And I'm going to have to bring this down to 3.7. How about 3.3? How about 3? There we go. And you'll notice in this example, a lot of these shadows start to become really, really gentle and really, really soft compared to the original right there, where we had a lot harder shadows. And with the same lighting setup, let's go ahead and go for a more extreme. So we'll go ahead and snapshot no AOVs. Now let's try going the opposite. So when your light source is smaller relative to your subject, your shadows are going to be much harder. So I'm just scaling this to a much smaller. I'm going to have to bring this value up quite a bit higher. Let's set that to something like 12. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and Command Snapshot. All right, so you can see same light source, trying to get the same energy levels, though it's kind of impossible. But look at the shadow qualities. Tiny light source, really, really hard shadows. Large light source, really, really soft shadows. Okay, and that also applies for distance too, right? If I take the, let's go back in here. Let's go ahead and go back to this right here. I want to go Command. Well, we already have this one. Let's delete that. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and take the same light source and just move it back all the way back here. We're also probably going to get a cast shadow showing up from the environment, which is a little bit annoying, or kind of annoying. So I'm not even sure if I'll be able to do this very adequately. But let's try increasing the exposure back up so we get the same relative value for our light source. Okay. So this is farther away, which means the light source is smaller relative to my character. And you'll notice, well, besides the light energy fall off being so different between them, look at those shadows as well. Those shadows are much stronger from the smaller light source or distant light source, and the shadows are much lower contrast and much softer in the closer or larger light source. So remember, the distance and the size of your light source is going to change the quality of your shadows. Okay, and also distance is really going to be changing the fall off of your light, because light falls off pretty dang quickly, right? I can't remember, I'll have to look it up 1 second. So light falls off, sorry, I had to look it up because I was going to say quadratic, but that wasn't quite right. So it's following what's called the inverse square law, which means that, let's go ahead and I'll take a snapshot of this. Command, snapshot, no AOVs. So this light source is close to the subject, and this one's further away. And so generally speaking, light falls off pretty quickly. And if your light source is close to your subject, then the light isn't actually going to travel very far, because you're increasing the brightness, but you're not increasing the distance that the light is actually going to be able to travel. So these are the same light sources, but this one right here is further away, but the energy is cranked much higher in order to get this subject lit. And so they're both relatively in the same area or distance relative to the light source, and so the background and this foreground and the subject are all kind of getting evenly lit the same amount, whereas if the light is closer, I don't have to crank up those values so much, and so the light, I'm doing a terrible job of explaining it, but generally speaking, what's happening is the light fall off is going to be much more noticeable when you have a close-up light source, because you're not having to crank up the values very much, and the light's just allowed to kind of fall off really quickly. Whereas if you're further away, this light source is actually really, really bright and really, really strong just to light the subject. And so that fall off is going to be less noticeable on a further away object. So you have to kind of keep some of those things in mind. Is when your light source is closer, the light falls off really quickly. If it's further away, it's not going to fall off as quickly. Okay, so size and distance affects the light fall off and the shadow quality. So let's go ahead and bring this light source back to our character. So I'm going to bring it back in a little bit, and I'm going to have to bring the exposure down. So you'll notice when I change the light source size, right, it's going to change my energy levels as well, right? So if I make it bigger, it's going to make it brighter, and when I make it smaller, it's going to be less bright. This is fairly physically accurate, right, that kind of adjustment or that relationship. What I like to do, though, just for artistic purposes, is I like to come down here into Advanced, click on this button called Normalize. What that's going to do is it's going to make it so the size of the light source isn't of changing the energy levels, and we'll have to bring that value back up. So let's go ahead and bring it back up to something like 9.5, sure. So I'll take that light source and I'll go ahead and scale it up. And you'll notice it does fall off, change the energy contribution a little bit, but way less noticeable. It's really, in reality, it's just changing fall off based on size. But generally speaking, the energy level is kind of staying pretty much the same. And so I'm not going to have to go back every time I change the scale and change the exposure to try to compensate. But what's great about this is I can really use my light source to change the size and affect my shadow qualities without having to worry about tweaking my exposure every time I make a small little adjustment on my light source. All right, so let's come back into this Refine tab that I had promised I'd come back into earlier. Let's make my light source a little bit smaller. Some of these settings can be a little confusing, and especially when you're using them, they're not quite as intuitive. Emission focus is going to add like a color or a gradient from the middle of the light source to the edges. So if I turn up the emission focus, what it's going to do is it's going to make it so the edges by default are emitting black light, which means that they're just emitting no light at all, but the center of the light is emitting my default color, right? And so it kind of makes it so instead of the whole square being the same emission intensity, it's going to have a fall off from the edges towards the center, which is kind of nice for getting like a gradient to your light or controlling where it hits. And you can also tint this a certain color. So let's go ahead and bring the saturation value up a little bit. Maybe not, well, let's do something like this. And so you'll see that center of the light is going to have my default color, and the edges of my light are going to have this tint to it. And that fall off is going to be really impacted by its emission focus value. If I set it to 0, it's not going to affect it at all, and as I creep it up, it's going to bleed closer and closer to the center until I get all the way up to 1. And then it's going to, very little of the middle of it's going to have my default color, and the edges are going to have that color. So I'll go ahead and set that to black by default and just turn that off to 0. Specular and diffuse amount are going to be how much the lighting is showing up in my specular reflective shading component or my diffuse shading component. So if I set this down to 0 on diffuse, it's only showing up in the reflections. And if I turn my specular down, it's only showing up in the diffuse layer. So the diffuse surface shading interactions. If you're confused about diffuse or specular, you can go back and watch my shading materials lecture where I talk about what's the difference between them. But in a layman's terms, specular is the reflective component of your object, and diffuse is going to be like the surface interactions, like your surface color and main shading. Intensity near distance, we're not going to worry about this too much, but it's going to essentially change the fall off a bit. So let's go ahead and crank this up. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. It's going to be affecting when the light source is really close to the subject. If you want to have something that's kind of like, let's set that to here. So even though I set normalized, you know how that changes so the scale isn't really affecting the light source that much, like the brightness intensity. Distance is still having a big impact on the intensity of our light source relative to our subject. But the intensity near distance should be playing with how the light falls off at a really close distance. And it's not working right now, so let me just double check if I'm doing the right setup. Here we go. So I had to push the value a little bit higher, but you'll see it's going to, it's really useful for objects that are closer to the light. You'll see as I change this value between here and here, you'll notice my character is actually getting brighter or getting darker, but the actual objects behind him aren't actually changing that much. And so this is essentially saying that especially you can see that light source is actually like right up on the character. If you have a light source that's really close to the character, by default, it's going to blow them out if I set it to 0, right? And so that energy is just so intense that right next to the character, it's blowing out the character a lot. And so you can use this value right here to kind of dial that back. And so it's not making the light source is still being able to light the scene, and you're not having to turn it all the way down, which means that this wouldn't be lit, right? If I just came up here and let's set that near intensity down to 0, and I change the exposure down, right, to match that, you'll see that that chair is no longer getting lit. So this can be used where if you don't want to actually have to turn down the light because it's illuminating important stuff, I can at least come in here and I can increase this near distance so that objects that are right up next to it aren't getting blown out. So this can be really helpful for if your light source is really close to your subject. Okay, I'll pull that back and we'll just set that back to 0. So by default, we probably don't want to mess around with it too much unless we're really noticing like a super sharp fall off between our character and the environment. Cone angle is going to be kind of like a emission focus, but it's more like you have barn doors on your light. And so this is essentially going to let you kind of focus like a spotlight. So by default, it's 90, which means it's everything in front of this light source is being illuminated, right, including everything to the side of it. And you'll see as I bring this in, you'll start to notice this little kind of cone shape it's not actually shaped like a cone, but it's this little kind of box filter that if you're using an actual disc light, it would look like a cone. But it's essentially acting like barn doors where I can control where my light is hitting, right? Which is really helpful if you're trying to prevent your light source from illuminating something like that. So like, let's say in this shot, I'm gonna have separate lights for my background and I don't really want this light source to hit this back here or right here. I only want it to really hit my character. I can use that cone angle and bring it in. to right there. And you'll notice by default it's going to have a sharp cutoff. You might want that in certain situations, but a lot of times you won't. If you want to have like a gentle transition, you can turn up this cone softness, right, which is going to blur it out, and then I'll have to make it a little bit bigger, right? And then I'll just kind of bring this up. And so if you want a gentle fall off for where that light hits and doesn't hit, then you can just use that cone softness. And there you go. And so you can see it's not hitting any of my environment because I'm kind of blocking it off with this cone angle. So those are the main settings we need. Up here is going to be my main intensity and color relationships. Down here is a little bit technical stuff where we are going to, if we want to change like the emission focus, so transitioning from a color to our default color, the shading components it's contributing to, that near density, distance density, intensity color, and then our cone angle to control where it hits. And then down here in advanced, the only setting I really would want you guys to worry about for now is normalize, which is going to be my that setting where the size of the light isn't affecting the intensity or exposure of the light source, which I personally always turn on. And I wish I'm sure there probably is, but I wish there was a setting in there to set that by default. Light samples, this is going to be for render quality, and that's something that you can come back to later on as you're optimizing your renders. But if you increase your samples, it's going to make your render give it a little bit more priority, or it's going to use more samples when it's calculating a light, so it's going to clean up a lot of noise and make your renders less noisy from that light source. But you want to only turn that on or increase it if you need it. Importance multiplier is going to be similar to that. If you have like 30 different lights and one of your lights is actually not as like important, like it's just a little bit of light, but it's causing a lot of noisiness and sampling issues, you can give it a lower importance, and so your renderer isn't going to give it as many samples, or is it's not going to let it. If you lower the importance, it's not going to need as many samples. If you increase the importance, it's going to let it create more samples. So it can kind of clean up some noise. Light groups is going to be for when you create render passes. If you want to have a separate image where you can, well, I don't have any good examples actually pulled up. And I don't think I'm going to get into render passes. That's going to be a separate issue later on, or a separate topic. But light groups is essentially lets you group lights into different render passes so you can actually edit them in post later on without having to re-render, which is really helpful. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to pull in this metal sphere. Oop, not the whole thing. Let's go ahead and Control Z. I'm going to Control D, Shift P, pull that out. So I have a metal sphere. And I wanted to show this one because I wanted to show, let's bring this roughness down a little bit, what these shapes of the light source look like. And this might not be the best example. It looks like, let me just fix this really quickly. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring the roughness all the way down, really, really low. And you'll see that shape of that light source is square. So this is generally really the only main thing, in my opinion, that I would really worry about the difference between disk and rectangle lights, is that its shape and your reflections. So this, if your light source that you want to simulate off screen or have as your key light, if you want it to be a square, like a window or like a fluorescent light, something that's like rectangular, you know, I can go ahead and use a rectangle light. And you'll see also, if I scale this up, right, that's another advantage of the rectangle light, is I can give it a non-uniform scale shape to it that kind of create, well, also you can do it with the disk light too, but I can, like, you know, wrap it a certain way, and you'll see it's also showing up in the reflections like that as well. So let's Control Z that back. If I go ahead and use a disk light, so I'm going to turn on the auto place lights with my current light selected, and we just add a disk light. And it should have, where's my disk light? Okay, so it didn't work in this case. Let me see if for some reason, maybe it doesn't work on lights, which is annoying. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull this light source over, like right here, pull that up, rotate it to look back at the subject. And I'm going to go ahead and hide my original light. So I'll grab this one, let's push the exposure up for my disk light. And you'll see this one instead is going to be a circular shape. So something like the sun or the moon or a desk lamp or a bulb is going to have a circular shape. So you could, it's not, in a lot of cases, this isn't that important. It's really dependent on how shiny or reflective your object is, and if it feels like it's very noticeable that you're getting square or circular reflections and you're like, that doesn't seem physically accurate, then you can worry about it. But generally speaking, especially when this was at a higher roughness, and it wasn't even that rough, it was like 0.2, which is still pretty sharp. Well, it's not that sharp, I guess. But both the square and the circle were getting blurred out so much that it wasn't very obvious. So that's the main difference between the disk and the rectangle light. You also see that with the disk light, I can't map an image to it because it's not a square shape. So let's go ahead and delete that. Let's bring back our rectangle light. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and, so the nice thing about the rectangle light, I'll show you guys distant light in a second, is that the size of my light source and the distance or placement of my light source is important, right? Size and distance is affecting energy fall off. Let's go ahead and go up here. I'm going to turn off my cone angle stuff. So set my cone angle back to 90, and I'm not going to worry about that too much. Let's bring that back down to 0. Everything else is kind of default, right? So my scale of my light source is really affecting my shadow quality, right? We're smaller, harsher. Distance is affecting shadow quality, and also light fall off, right? So if I go ahead and bring out, I'd probably bring the exposure up. Let's set that to 11. Right, where if it's coming from far away, the fall off is going to be much slower, and so light's not going to fall off quickly from one object to the next object if the light source is really far away. And so that's great because most light sources that are on Earth and not in the sky, in the sun or with the sun or the moon, are going to be like this, right? They're going to have like a relative distance to the character. Even like a street light, I would still kind of have actually in the scene at the distance of a real street light and just adjust the intensity and settings to set my to hit my character, right? Let's go ahead and bring that back in. The other light, besides the disk light and rectangle light, that would be a primary lighting source, is going to be our distant light. What a distant light does is it's simulating a really far away light source like the sun or the moon. And you'll notice, the first thing you'll notice is it doesn't actually matter where it is in the scene. This is behind the character, pointing in this direction, but it's still lighting the front of my character. And that's because with a real life distant light, the location of the light isn't actually like relative to us on Earth, right? Where like it doesn't, like, you're not changing the position of the light source in the space, in a local space. You're really worrying about what direction in the sky it's coming from. So your position of the distant light isn't important. You'll also notice all the shadows are really hard, and that's because the sun or the moon are really, really, really distant, far away light sources. We can change this angle extent to change the softness or sharpness of our shadows, right? So we can come in here and I can set this to a lower value. And you'll notice it's going to be we'll probably have to change the exposure up again to help with it. But it's going to be sharper, and if I bring the angle extent up higher, I don't use the distant light as much. It should be a softer light and help with the softer shadows. I might get that backwards. Let me just double check that. Okay, I was correct. So the higher the number, the softer the shadows. And again, you can push it higher than the default. So if I set that to like 10, it's going to give me a softer diffuse light source. But generally speaking, all you really worry about with this one is the angle or the direction the light is pointing in. And I'm inside, so I'm getting some weird shadows going on in here as like these objects start to block light. But that's going to be, let's go ahead and set this. Let's see if we can get it coming in through that back window. You can kind of see it coming in right there, right? And so that's that light source coming in from that. All the light's coming from this direction, so it goes through that window. But the light, this wall right here, is blocking that light source from hitting my character. Okay, so that's a distant light. It's just great for simulating a distant light source like the sun or the moon for the most part. We also have a dome light, so I'll click on this button right here for a dome light. What a dome light does is it's a sphere, and that sphere is going to be, every point on that sphere, kind of like our disk and rectangle light, the surface of it emits light from each of those points in space. With the sphere, it's actually creating a sphere around our scene, and each point on the sphere is emitting light, right? And so we're getting light coming from all directions. By default, it's only, let's go ahead, I want to hide the cabin so we can see this on our character. So by default, and let's get rid of that. Actually, let's leave that sphere. No, let's get rid of the sphere. All right. So by default, it's just white, and so that means that light is evenly coming from every every direction, as you might imagine, that looks kind of gross. It's just really flattening out our scene. And so what we use with a dome light is a color map or an high dynamic range image. So there's some that come into by default with Renderman, but I mean, use them if it makes sense with your scene, but you should find an HDRI that makes sense with your environment. So let's go ahead and I have a bunch of these in here. So let's go ahead and bring in maybe, let's see, let's double check these. RV Garage, maybe. So what it's going to do is it's going to take that image that you're loaded in and turn it into a light source. So let's go ahead and rotate that forward. And so, and I'll turn off primary visibility, or let's leave primary visibility on. Let's go ahead and increase the exposure a little bit. So everything in that image, including like that light source that's coming from outside that garage window, and I think there's even a window right here that's a primary light source. Every single pixel, even objects that are reflecting light, are going to be acting as light sources with this image. I can use a different image. Let's go in here and do this gazebo sunset. Let's try that. Okay. So you can see all these different colors are showing up and contributing to my scene. And I'm going to turn off primary visibility so it's not showing up in my actual render. So you see I'm getting like this orange from the top of the gazebo, this blue from like the evening night sky or the dusk sunset sky, right? Also, I'm realizing my colors probably look a little funky. There we go. It's a little less saturated. And so what we can do is, this is really great for a couple things. First, it's great for simulating complex bounce and ambient light that might be happening in your, that you want to simulate without actually having to create an environment. Because remember, a lot of our lighting interactions and a lot of what we see in life isn't coming directly from a light source, but is light bouncing off of our environment and reflecting into us, right? Think about your room on like a bright sunny day, and you don't have lights on inside. You know, you're still getting light inside your room, even if it's not, you know, all directly coming from the sun, like it's directly in the sun's path, but you're getting a lot of bounce lighting coming from outside and lights collecting, gathering, and bouncing around your environment. And so all those different colors, the shape of the room, all the different objects are changing that creating that complex interaction of light with your object, right? This looks like I have a really complex scene and really complex lighting setup with just an image. So these can be really great for simulating that kind of interaction or that environment that creates that. But what's important is I want to make sure if I do that, that whatever image I'm using makes sense with my scene. I wouldn't want to use like a sun image, right? Let's go ahead and I'll use one of the preset browser ones. Let's go to outdoor, right? I wouldn't want to use this middle of the day light setup right here, and I'm going to have to bring the exposure down because this one's much brighter. So let's bring this back down. All right, so this one's a really bright, overcast, mid-noon kind of lighting setup, and so I wouldn't want to use this for a night interior scene because that's going to be really weird. Another thing you might want to keep in mind is, I'm going to Control-Z this back to get the other one. You might want those complex lighting interactions, but it might be changing the color too much. Like it's not quite the colors you're going for. You can come in here, you can change that map saturation. So we're still getting these complex light and fill and ambient interactions without actually tinting my figure, which can be really helpful. And so when I use a dome light, unless I'm doing it for testing materials, generally speaking, I don't let it be my primary light source. I'll actually usually bring it down and let it be a little bit of a fill light if I want it to be in my scene at all, and just let my main key light, like my disk light and my rectangle light, my distant lights, actually be my primary lighting sources, and just use this to kind of help fill in the light. So let's go ahead and bring in my main light source, and I'll go ahead and pull this over to the other side and let it kind of fill in my space into my shadow area and create a little bit more complex ambient bounce lighting. So you can use it as a fill, right? So you can see that kind of complements my key light really well. But it's really not necessary to use these at all. The other thing I would say that's really important for, let's go ahead and Control-Z this back. What's really important for these, what's really useful for this dome light, let's go ahead and enable, let's grab this dome light. Let's go ahead and turn on saturation. So let's set that back to 1, is with reflections. One thing, let's go ahead and we'll transition now into talking about materials a little bit. We're not going to go into materials because you can go back and watch that. But materials are really important for my lighting setups. Let's go ahead and, or changing my lights. So let's go ahead and show this right here really quickly. So I have a dome light in here and I have a key light. All right, so there's a couple things we want to keep in mind. First is, let's go ahead and continue talking about the dome light for now. So with reflections, most objects that are specular reflected, right, where you just, or, they're just kind of have that specular reflection, but most of it has a diffuse component, which is almost all non-metals. They look like this, right? And that's fine. You don't like my character and this material. It's fine that I have a really simple lighting setup, and this reflections is all we really need, right? Because we're not really seeing a really reflective environment. But on a metal, your metal won't appear quite right? So you'll see this is like a steel chrome ball. Even though it looks like it might be kind of metalish, it doesn't look right, and that's because there is no environment behind my light source. It's just a black void. And unless you want a studio, right? Like let's say you're making like a studio environment in your animation and you're trying to simulate that, where all the lights in the environment would be off except for these primary lights, that starts to look a little fake, right? It starts to feel like there's nothing in this space and this metal just becomes super flat. If you have a dome light though, or if you just have parts of your scene behind it, you can actually get some pretty complex, and I might even go in here and turn off this key light just so we can take a look at this, right? We can get some realistic, complex reflections going on here, and it's simulating an environment that I can see, right? And so metals might need a dome light, or it might need like some kind of plane with an image on it, just so you can get some nice looking reflections. Alternatively, you could just bring your environment in there, right? Or put stuff behind the camera so they show up in reflections, and so your reflections don't end up just black. But that becomes a little inefficient and a little expensive. So using a dome light or using a some kind of image just behind the camera, just so your metals will actually reflect something, can be a good strategy. And I might even drop this down, even though I might not use this environment light for my primary lighting on in my scene. I can use that environment light to at least show up in my reflections if I wanted to. So let's go ahead and now transition to talking. This is going to be a really quick conversation about materials. So let's go ahead and I'm going to Control Z this all the way back when I had that light source. So we talked about metals. And so with metals, it's primarily reflection, so it's going to show your lights a lot. And if you don't have any environments in your scene for the light to reflect, or the material to reflect, it's going to show black. I want you guys to keep in mind that your materials are going to change your lighting a lot. I'm not going to be setting up materials in this demonstration because I don't want to spend a whole lot of time assigning a unique material to everything. But you can see just the surface value, the diffuse value between certain objects is having a big impact on how it's being revealed and shaded, right? So this surface over here is almost black, and the surface right here is a lighter color, right? That drastically changes the brightness or values of these objects. This one's almost disappears, this one pops, right? And so you need to keep in mind that if you're just lighting on everything with the same grayscale or white value, things are going to change when you put your real materials on, because then you're going to have to go back and adjust all of your lights, because let's say you lit your object with like this blue color, but in reality when it renders it's going to be this black color later on when you add materials. Oh my god, I thought it was going to be this bright. It's actually this dark. So you want to make an initial material pass if you can on all of your objects, so that you at least get a good idea of what the basic color is going to be and the reflectivity is going to be. Same thing with metals, right? This metal looks way different than this black object, and so if you don't give a metal shader to something when you're lighting, but later on it's going to be metal, it's going to change so much, and you're going to have to go back kind of to square one and try to fix that part. Something else I want to talk about is also when you're doing materials, I want you to make sure you're putting specular on it. So metal obviously is going to have specular, but even your non-metals should have specular. So you can see this object right here has a specular face color, and the face color is really low, but it's still on, right? And then it has a bright edge color, which is my preference. And even with a low roughness or a sharp roughness, right? Even if you want your object to not really be shiny and increase the roughness, that roughness or that rough specular adds a lot of shaping to your object, and everything has specular reflections to it. Whether it's really, really rough and dim or really sharp and shiny, right? And bright and shiny, you want everything to have a specular to it. So make sure you have specular as well. You can see over here how these are the two same materials, the same objects, how that specular reflection right there just adds a little extra dimensionality and shaping to it and realistic interaction with the light source, whereas this one over here doesn't have any specular reflections on it, so it just becomes flat and nothing. Speaking of that edge color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and duplicate my light. So let's go duplicate. Let's go ahead and rotate it. World. I'm going to have it come back from behind the characters. Let's go over here. So this edge color is going to have a big impact on your rim lighting. So when you do rim lights and you want to get that sharp backlight that kind of highlights the character or a character and then just like creates this like nice breakup or separation from the background, your material's edge color is specular edge color is going to be impacting that. So if I bring that edge color down, or if you have the edge color too similar to your base color, that or the face color, then that reflection gets a little hard to work with, right? Because you'll have to crank up this light really bright in order to get these sharp reflections around the surface. This light source also feels like it's probably a little too bright, so let's bring that down. Right, and so you can see it's almost unnoticeable. So by default, it's a good material setting is for your edge color to be brighter than your face color for specular, but it also makes it easier for you to add or bring in those rim lights. So when you're adjusting your materials for lighting, if you really want to get those rim lights, those edge lights to pop, or backlights to pop more, go ahead and make sure you're setting your edge color for your material brighter. So that's pretty much all I want to talk about for materials. Let's go ahead and we'll go in and look at how I did my lighting setup within my scene and using all these different lights and these different settings and talk you guys through them. So first, you can see this is looking really complex. And once you break it down, it's not that bad. It's just the shapes of all these Maya or Renderman plugins, starts to intersect and look really complicated and crazy. But really, it's not that many lights going on in here, or that many different changes. And I'm going to show you really quickly how I kind of broke it down. So, and just showing you guys my process going through it. And your lighting is going to look really bad from the beginning. Just like anything else, it takes iteration, it takes time to make it look good, right? So my first setup was just getting lights to work in my scene. Then I got my right camera position, then I got my key light going on my character, and then I got this kind of window backlight going on too. Those are the two parts I knew I wanted to get. You can also see there's a little bit of a fill light. So I was getting a primary lighting structure, and I'm missing some steps in here just because I didn't accurately document my work. And so you can see just how this starts to refine and improve over time, right? And here I kind of wanted to get more of like a yellow candle-y light coming from over here. And you can see I'm playing with the color and emission focus to change that color going from a warm orange red to yellow. Playing with that moonlight that's coming in, I wanted to get that specific shape back there and also get a little bit of extra fill. And I was definitely changing the different color temperatures in here, right? Playing with intensity, I was pulling back on some of these lights, making that light source coming from the side a little bit stronger. You'll see at one point I felt like because I was going to have this really strong blue moonlight on the character, it didn't feel as good because I was putting both that rim light and the key light on the same side of the character. So what I did is I actually moved the key light to the other side so I can have this really strong blue rim light to kind of add a nice contrast or balance against the key light. And you can see now I'm going ahead, and this is where I was getting closer and closer to what I have now, where I was adding a little extra fill to my front side. You can also call this a wrap light, where it feels like the key light right here is starting to wrap around the character and have a nice fall off. In reality, it's just a new light that I added just to add a little color or transition from the key light to the shadow side. Kind of acts like a fill light. You see I added a light here to separate the shoulder from the background a little bit more, and also just to make it feel like we feel like there's like a fire or a candle or something like right here, and it felt like the chair wasn't getting it and just the character was. So I was kind of adding that so we get like a bright to dark fall off. You'll also notice some other things over here. Let's go ahead and drop this down. I was adding some shaping. This is something, remember our lighting, we're trying to set a mood, and we're also trying to tell a story. So setting the mood, I was setting the atmosphere of it being like nighttime. We have cool exterior moonlighting coming in to set the time of day, and I'm having my primary lighting source be like this candle or this fireplace inside the space. And also I'm changing these, using these lightings to shape my character, right? Getting this nice key light coming from the side, using this rim light to help pop the shape of the character a little bit, and some fill to fill in the dark areas. And I'm doing that shaping as well on my environment. So this is something I added fairly early on, probably from the beginning, but this is actually a fake. This isn't coming from the moonlight out there. This chair actually has its own little rim light to make it feel like the moon in the exterior is still lighting it. And same thing with that blanket, even though the light that's coming from out here actually isn't hitting that surface right there. Same thing with the character, right? It feels like that might be coming from outside. In reality, there's a light source that you can see. This the light source right here is right next to the character. So there's that chair rim right here, right? That's helping shape the chair, and here's that window or that character rim that feels like it's coming from the window, but really it's a separate light source on the character. And you'll see I'm also adding a little bit of shaping right here as well. So I'm getting a little extra dimensionality because I felt like it got a little too flat right here. So you can see I'm adding a little extra dimensionality with that blue color coming in. I think I dialed it back a little bit right there in the following shot. Here's where you can see I'm getting a little bit extra shaping right there. So there's a little extra, I put an extra little light up there so these objects feel a little bit more dimensional up there. And you'll also notice at this point I'm also adding volumetrics. And I don't really want, I'm not going to cover volumetrics too much. I'll show you guys what I use. They're pretty easy. You just drop in like a shape of the volume. So I have this square, right? And essentially you're filling it with a fog or an atmosphere. And as light travels through it, it kind of reveals itself like a god ray, right? So if I drop back and forth between these, you know, it's actually lighting up this fog inside here. And there's another one right here to kind of get like a little bit of like a glow coming from the fireplace or the candle. In reality, I could add that part right there in through post-processing in like After Effects or Photoshop, and just add a gradient there, which would be a lot cheaper. But you'll see I'm just trying to get the shaping of those lights as well. So I built it up over, you know, like many steps over time to kind of refine it. And so that's something that you guys just, when you're working on it, it's not going to look very good at first. But what we want to focus on is we want to focus on setting a mood, telling a story. We want to use directing our eye using contrast and focal points, right? So you'll see my background stays very low contrast. I might even go in and pull back on this pan so it doesn't pop so much. But all the contrast is on my character's body and face, right? So I want to, you know, the most interesting lighting, the highest contrast between light and shadow is on the character's face. The direction of the lighting is shaping the character well, right? So I can really understand their shape their form very nicely, and it creates appealing kind of lighting setup. So we want to tell a story, set a mood, set a time, direct the eye, and shape our characters with our lights. So let's go ahead and let's try to dive into this a little bit more detailed. Okay, I want to start with my key light. So I just drop in a Pixar Rect light. And so remember, the key light is going to be your primary lighting source. And it's also going to be the one that establishes the main light and shadow side of my character. In this case, after adding a bunch of other lights, you know, I kept this really more to the side, but in reality, when I was starting off, I wanted this light source to be more from the front of the character, not so much from the side, because too much of my character is falling to shadow. I kind of wanted to get that 45-degree Rembrandt lighting. What I don't want, and let me go ahead and show you a really quick handy tool, or handy method that I'll often use for rotating my light. A lot of times when you move your light source, you know, you'll get it the wrong, like let's say I want to rotate it so it's coming from the left-hand side. You'll notice that when I move this around, I'm changing the distance, and I'm not getting the right angle, right? So I have to go here, rotate it again. If it's not the right distance, I'm going to have to move it closer. Something you can do that can be really helpful, two things, is you can either put it in a group, so you can just press Control G to put it in a group, and move that, make sure that group's pivot point is where you want to rotate it around. So let's say it's the character, I want to rotate around the character. Now you'll see when I rotate it, it's always going to keep pointing at the character and it's going to stay the same distance away from the character. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing I do that's a little bit faster but definitely a little bit messier is I like to press D on my keyboard to change my pivot point, hold V to snap to vertices, and then I'll just drop the pivot point for my light onto my character. And then that way, when I rotate it, it's just like that group, it's going to rotate around the character and stay pointing towards them. And then when I'm done doing that, I might go back in and do modify center pivot to set that pivot point back into my light source. I'm going to go ahead and turn off this emission stuff. So I'm going to set that to black, set that to 0. And you'll see here I'm using, because I was trying to get like a very specific, I was pulling from a very specific reference. I was looking at some lighting from Klaus. You can see here. I will say, please don't compare me to this because I am not a lighter, and these guys are way better at this stuff than I am. But I was looking at this as reference of like some moonlight and interior, like warm flame sort of lighting. So I wanted to get that kind of like sharper, harsher, yellowy light. And so I was finding that was easier for me to do by I was trying to do it with the temperature first. So just enabling temperature and letting this be desaturated. So we'll just set the saturation down to 0. Let's turn off the temperature for a second, and then we'll go ahead and set this to, you can see I pushed the values too far, so I'll set that back to white, maybe increase the exposure a little bit, and then I could try first by just enabling temperature and then just setting that value to like a yellowy color. But I was having a lot of trouble doing that, so I was using my map saturation to help push that yellow color a little bit more. And so it was a little fake, not very realistic, but that in my case, I just wanted to kind of get that feeling to it. So I was going ahead and just, let's go to that yellow right here, a little yellow-orange, more saturated. And I was having to play a little bit more with those settings to try to get it to the degree I wanted it to. But let's go ahead for now. I'm going to go ahead and desaturate this. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll try to get the lighting structure down first and then not worry about color too much, because if you worry about color too much while you're working, it can be a little hard to progress, right? Because you'll be obsessing over the color. So I could give it a little bit of a tint just to give it a little bit of warmth to it. So what I do is I make sure that this lighting structure is kind of nice for my character. So if I have it too close to my camera, or right in front of my camera, right? So my camera is right here. It tends to flatten out my character. So you, generally speaking, do not want your light source to be coming from the same direction as your camera. You want it to the left or to the right, right? So you want it to kind of come from the side. And so a lot of this is also subjective, but generally speaking, I like it to be at a 45-degree angle to the character. So coming somewhere between the side and the front of the character creates like a nice shadow pattern. If I wanted to get that Rembrandt lighting, I could kind of move it a little bit more to the side to try to get that cheek angle. And what I could do also is I could go ahead and set that to be coming a little bit from the top as well. So that's really, if you're ever in doubt and you can work with it, really appealing lighting is 45-degree angles to the character and tilted up 45 degrees as well. And when I say to the character, I mean from their nose. So let's go ahead and go to world, and we can look at it from the other side. So it just creates like a really nice shaping to the character and figure. And so right here, it's a little too close to the camera, so I'll just kind of pull it over more to the side. So like I said, in reality, I kind of liked this lighting shadow setup better right here. We have that far key lighting setup where the light source is coming from the other side of the character from the camera. So the camera's on the character's left side and the light's on the right side. But in my case, because I was having that blue rim light coming from the window, I kind of liked it better coming from over here. And because I wanted it to feel a little bit like it could be a lantern that's like hanging from the ceiling, right? So that could make sense. But in my case, I was wanting it to be like that Klaus, where it's going to be like a candle or a flame that's in the space. So I had it a little bit more from the side right here, something like that. So it makes it a little dramatic, but that's okay. Something else I was doing is I'm going to go ahead and come in here to the cone angle. Let's go ahead and drop that to 90. Right, and generally speaking, actually, I don't think this is really changing that much because the light source is pretty close to my character. That fall off isn't really spilling into my background that much. But I was originally using this cone angle to bring it in and tighten it on my character so it's spilling less on the environment. And so I'm focusing it on more on the character. And you'll often, if you can get lighting to work on your character and your environment at the same time, that's great. But a lot of times you'll have specific lighting for your character or background versus your foreground. And just use that cone softness to make that fall off not a sharp line so it doesn't cut something randomly. So I'll just bring up that cone angle. Okay, so that was my main key light. In terms of intensity, again, using exposure as my main setting. I'm trying to keep things from blowing out too much. So I just dropped it maybe a little bit lower than this. And I'm just gonna keep adding light as I go along. But what you do want to do is always, in my opinion, start from the key light and get that working first on your character. And you might even want to go ahead and start working on the environment. So I think I have a background light. Making sure that you're working on all of your lights at the same time. But actually I have this outside moonlight that's going to be another large lighting source in my environment. So I'll go ahead and undo that fill light because that's going to be supplementing it. So let's keep talking about the character for now. Actually, let's move to the moonlight. So this isn't specific to y'all's short or your whatever you're working on, but I still don't have like my primary lighting source for my whole environment. I only have it for my character right now, and this is just how I'm working for this. This might not be how you want to actually approach this. So in my scene, though, I know that most of my environment is going to have a little bit of this warm fill from the candle light. So what I could do is I could go ahead and maybe I can go ahead and let it spill out onto my environment, or I might duplicate this light source. So Control D, and I might go ahead and let this be like a broader. So let's go ahead and set this cone angle wider. Right, and I can let this kind of fill in the space if I want most of this background to be lit by my that same lighting source, right? And so I could do it that way. In my case, my environment lighting is more coming from this outside moonlight. So let's go ahead and Shift H. So what I did with this is since it's the moon, I had two options. One is I could go ahead and use a distant light. But in my case, what I preferred was I wanted the ability to control the softness of the shadows and also where this is actually hitting with a rectangle light, because with a distant light, the light was coming through the slats, it was coming through the breaks in the wall. I would have to build a lot of blockers or kind of block off that light as much as possible in a lot of different ways. So it would be very challenging. So what I did is I actually just made my light source really, really, really small to simulate a really distant light. Because remember, if you're a really far away light or a distant light, it's going to have really sharp shadows, and because it appears as a really tiny light source. And so I was just changing the size of this light source so that I can get these sharper shadows coming from here onto this background. And I'm really was early on just trying to get that shaping of that background, that moonlight coming in from the outside. And this might have been also jumping ahead a little bit too much, but this is what I liked. Another thing I was doing is, so I did soften this a little bit. So if I was working with an actual distant light, you'll see these shadows back here. If I made this really small, those shadows get really, really hard, which might make sense. But in my case, I wanted it to feel a little bit more soft and bouncy. So I just kind of scaled it up just enough so that I can kind of see those shapes from the slats. But then I don't need to worry about them being too sharp and too high contrast. And I could even scale it up a little bit more if I wanted it to blur out a bit more, kind of like that. One issue that I've never really resolved is that I'm getting a really intense lights right here. What I probably would do is I could play with that near distance, right? So let's try setting that up to, let's say 11. Let's say 20. Let's say 40. And so at a certain point, if you do if you increase your near or bring up the near distance, it's going to pull back on that brightness or that intensity closer to the light source itself, So if you have anything that's kind of blowing out because the light source is kind of close to it, then you can use that near intensity. I try not to use it if I can. Another thing you could do is I could always change those material properties of those objects and adjust it with my Pixar surface and just make them less reflective or make their diffuse color darker so they're not quite as bright. So I put that light source out there, and again, I used my cone angle to control where it's coming in, because if I didn't have that cone angle, if I was set to 90, there's different random little spots and slats in the walls that the light was coming in through. So I was using that cone angle to try to limit it so it's only coming in through that window, not through these random little slats. And I was just getting that placement of the light source so it got this really nice shape behind the character. And really, again, it's all about believability rather than accuracy. I'm designing this to make it have like a nice separation or contrast of the character behind the character. They're creating this like kind of triangular shape behind them, and just add a nice contrast to the warmth on them. And so I was just kind of playing around with its position to get that, but I'm not going to get into that too much, of course. Let's go back to the character. So now that I had this moonlight, I knew that I was going to get these cool rim lights that I could work with. So I'm going to go ahead and show this light source right here. So this rim light right here is coming from the same direction as the window, but just like what I was saying just a second ago with the window, I'm not worrying too much about if it's coming from the exact right angle or being physically plausible. It's enough for you as the viewer to understand that it feels like it's coming from the window, and this is motivated by moonlight. And maybe it's too bright, and I could bring it down a little bit, but without it, let's go ahead and do Command Snapshot. Without it, when I turn that off, we can add some fill light, but that whole shadow area of my character disappears and has no definition, and also the shape of the character, like their outline of their head, is eaten away by the shadow. It just merges, and I can't really understand where the character starts and stops with the environment. And they don't really, besides the light side, it doesn't really separate very well. So as soon as I added that rim light, it really pops that head away from the background. We get a little bit more better form and definition in the shadow area, where before this all becomes just like a flat shape. I get a little bit of extra shape in the anatomy, like on the neck and on that, like, you know, the trachea area, on the nose. And so that rim light or side light or backlight can really help shape and define and separate the character a little bit. And I also added a fill light. So I'm assuming, let's go ahead and bring that in. So let's go ahead and show this. Let's do Command Snapshot. And so let's show this with and without. I'll go ahead and hide that. Let's do Control H. So that fill light I added just to kind of help fill in some of these shadow areas that are coming from the front. So it doesn't have quite, I'm not losing so much of the character into darkness, and just bringing up the shadows a little bit so they're not quite as dark. And this fill light, let's go ahead and bring that back in, is pretty large and broad. It doesn't need to be this large and broad. It can be a little bit lower. One of the problems with it being larger is it takes longer to calculate. As you can kind of see, it's kind of requiring more samples. But if I'm trying to get this to have like a soft look and wrap around the character, it kind of helps for it to be larger. But let's go ahead and bring that down a little bit lower. It's going to calculate a lot faster the smaller the light source is. Let's go ahead and bring that down. And I can bring that in. But generally speaking, with my fill light, it's going to be on the opposite side of my character from the key light, because I'm just trying to get this into the shadow areas. And I might even have this a little bit more from the side just to kind of help get into some of these shadows. And so this is really just meant to balance out the key light a little bit. And the more intense I make this, of course, the closer the lighting ratio is between the key light and fill light, and the less it flattens the character a little bit, but it also illuminates them better, and it feels a little less dramatic and a little less scary, right? But I'm going to bring that down because I do want it to be a little moody and a little dark. And so that, with my character's rim light, is kind of really helping bring out the shadow side of my character. So here's just let's go to this one. So this is the rim, the fill, and the key light. And here's that fill and rim kind of bringing in that side. Okay. So one other thing I was doing here is I have what's called key wrap lights. And I don't know if these are the proper terminology for them. I've definitely heard it described as a wrap light. And so what they are is just, they're kind of like secondary rim lights, or sorry, secondary key lights that are supposed to help the key light wrap around the character. Let's get rid of the rim and fill just a second. And then let's go ahead and I'll go do command, snapshots, and I'm going to go ahead and hide that. So one, it gave a little extra color, so I wasn't just getting a yellow color from the candlelight. I wanted a little bit of a like a transition from yellow to warm color, right? So it was also adding a little bit of warmth into this transition, but it also was helping wrap the key light from the side into the character. And when I did that, I actually started setting up the key light to come more from the side, so that those key wrap lights, and I actually created 2 of them, got a little bit more of that frontal lighting, so it wraps from the side around to the front of the character. And I have 2 of them actually, to kind of help me out. And I'm not a great lighter, so there's probably a more efficient way of doing this, but it's just to create this transition from my key light to kind of like a wrap around the character a little bit better. And the colors are also definitely getting a little funky. And I played around a lot with the color of this to kind of make it hopefully feel a little bit more like a fire source. And I even used this emission focus on my key light with like a darker orange color, which gives you obviously a brown. Something like that. And then let's set that emission focus value a little bit higher, so that it had like a more centrally yellow color, and then it kind of starts to transition to that reddish color that we're seeing on the transition. So I'm really messing up all my colors just to kind of show this. And let's bring that saturation down. Okay. Anyways, okay, this is going to look a little ugly, but that's okay. Pretend it's looking like I had it earlier after I worked on it a long time. All right. So, and I'm going to bring back down that emission focus. Just have that chill out a little bit and bring that saturation down a bit. Okay, so I brought in these key wrap lights, and let's go ahead and bring back in my rim and fill light, right? And so something else I might want to do is I might maybe want a secondary rim, because what I might do is I might take my rim light so that it kind of captures the top of the head a little bit. So you can see it kind of, this part right here gets a little funky and gets lost, and also the back of the ear is getting missing. So what I might do is I might have this, I can scale this up so that it feels like it's actually reaching the top of the head a bit more, maybe even rotating it down on the character a bit, moving it up. So it's going to wrap around the top of their head a bit. And I might even need to bring it more from the back so it catches the ear a bit, if I really need to get that ear. So that position of that rim light is really just meant to help separate that character a little bit. I don't want like an edge going all the way around the character, just enough to kind of separate them from the background so that I get a little bit of shaping on the character. All right, I was doing the same thing with the furniture. So on the furniture, or on the, you can see this lighting setup. I probably would go back and change this up quite a bit, especially like right here. That emission focus. Be careful with that emission focus. It can look really fake, like it does right here, really quickly. So I added I called this a shape. Actually, let's do the furniture chair rim. So I have a chair rim, right? So this chair rim light is just like the character's rim light. It's supposed to feel like that rim light coming from the window, and that helps separate it from the background, right? And adds a little extra dimensionality to it. You can see it's really kind of highlighting some of these details and adding a little extra volume and interest. I might even bring it back a little bit so it's not quite so bright, but I think this is okay. I also added a shaping light. So that's the light that's coming from the bottom left to add just a little bit of extra fill into this area, just an extra dimensionality to it. Added a warm light to the chair because it just wasn't quite getting enough of that key light, so I just went ahead and added a light source right. That's you can see it right here, and that one's just specifically hitting that chair right there to just kind of feel like it's getting a little bit of that candle firelight as well. And again, all my colors got really funky, so this isn't working anymore. And And then on my background, because I'm getting a lot of this nice fill from or spillage from my key lights, I wasn't really worried too much about having to light up my background. What I didn't want it to do is I wanted it to feel like it's a dark cabin, right? And so that the primary lighting source is something like a candle or this fireplace or this lantern or this candle light that's off scene. And so I wanted it to really just light up this area close to the character. And so I thought this was acceptable, a little bit enough that I can kind of see it, but I was adding a little extra light into it. So I added a background fill light. And so that was just to kind of add a little bit more blue and a little bit more presence back to this shape over here, so that it's not just like a sharp, color light from the outside. It kind of spills and bounces around a little bit. And you can see that light source right here. It's just this kind of blue light hitting right in that background right there. Also added a little bit on the shelf because the shelf was a little too dark, so I just go ahead and bring that back. And so I just added a little extra light up here. And really what I was trying to do is I was trying to get a little extra shaping on these assets right here. And so I was getting a little bit of a left light on it. And I probably could increase it a little bit higher just because that background just becomes too flat and just not very interesting or hasn't have very much depth. And then I added this moon spill light right here. And so let's go ahead and bring that back in. And this one's really, really subtle, but this one was just a light source that's right here and is just meant to, it's really only noticeable when I bring in the volume, but that was just to get a little extra light spilling out of here in multiple directions instead of just in this singular direction. So that's my primary lighting setup of all these different lights. I probably, like I said, the colors got really funky compared to the original. Because I just kind of mess with them a little bit too much. So I have to dial them back. In this, I just want to show you guys the basic how to set up lights and move them around and position them. But I do want to show you some other things I was working on. So there's a candle block or a light blocker, and what that does is it's a object that blocks your light. And so with your light selected, you can go up here and click on blocker, and there's a lot of different types of blockers. So I was just using a blocker light filter, and so that just drops in a shape that lets you block out light. You can do other things, like you can run it through like a filter or a gobo, which just kind of controls, or a cookie, which is just controlling the shaping of your light, so it comes in as a shape instead of just as a uniform source of light. If I go ahead and bring this in. This one, I think at this point, probably isn't even doing anything. And when you do this, you might have to, I know when I do this, I always have to restart IPR because IPR doesn't capture everything. So let's go ahead, like every change you make. So what this does is, let's go ahead and I'll turn off invert. So what I'm using this as is I'm trying to use this with my key lights so that they only hit over here and don't spill into the background too much. And so I inverted it, so everything that's inside the blocker is actually getting lit and everything outside the blocker is actually being blocked. But if I invert it, you'll see that that key light is now being blocked, and you'll see now it's spilling onto the background, right? Because everything that's inside of this shape is being blocked and everything outside of that shape is allowed to be lit by that key light. Let's go ahead and invert it again. And so now everything inside this shape is allowed to be hit by the key light and everything outside is not. So a blocker can be really helpful for like really kind of like fine tuning where your light sources that you're creating are hitting, so that you're not, I want to add like a light on the background to kind of lighten it up. I might have to put it in a position where it would normally hit my character, and it gets a little tough because then you're having to like, oh, I need to block this so that doesn't hit that. But this light blocker can really kind of help you fake that lighting fall off a lot. Like I said, I don't want to get into how to use these too much. I'll go ahead and hide that for a second because I want to show you guys my volumes. So the volumes, they're just these shapes right here that I've added this Pixar volume. So you go here, add Pixar volume, and there's a lot more to it. So I don't, once you add these primitive shapes, I would suggest watching a supplementary video on it, just because it takes too long to go over every possible thing we can do. But what this does is it lets any light that travels through it kind of show up as a volume or a presence. And so you can see before, all that light that's coming from outside, let's go and delete this one. All that light that was coming from outside, it doesn't show up until it hits the surface, but now it feels like it's traveling through dust or an atmosphere, right? And I can just come in here to that Pixar volume and I can change the density. I have it pretty low. By default, it's like 1, which you could see looks like it's just like super, super thick, right? Which is obviously not what we want to do. And so that density is just like the density of that volume. So let's set that to 0.01, I think is what I started with when I was first working on it. And I was just dialing it back because you don't want it to feel like there's smoke in the room, unless you do. And you can see I'm also limiting it because by default it was kind of like taking up the entire room like this. And so let's go ahead and, because I'm scaling this up, I'm gonna have to increase the density. So let's set that to 0.3. Set that to 1. Oh, maybe I have to try restarting IPR. And I might be also misunderstanding the settings in the Pixar volume, which would not surprise me. So there's something about what I've done here that's, oh, there we go, now it's showing up. There's something weird about it once it gets to a certain scale. Or maybe once my camera's inside of it, it stops working, I don't know. But there's something weird about it. But you can see that if I include my character, even if I drop this density value really low, so let's say 0.01, you know, it might feel correct or what I want for that background, but it's kind of blurring out everything else, and you just don't want the whole scene to feel like there's smoke inside the environment. So I was using that, limiting that shape, so I just wanted it on that background so I can get those kind of God rays coming in. Also did one for the candle right here, but in reality, just so I can get like this kind of ambient light coming from like the off camera light source that adds a little bit of presence back to it, right? So you can see when that's in, we can kind of see it feels like there's a light source right off camera. But in reality, because I'm not trying to get like these God rays like I am in the background, this volume is just adding extra render time. So I probably would just actually get rid of that one so it renders faster, and then I would just do in post-processing, just add like a, post-processing or post, I would just add like a gradient kind of color shape right here so it feels like there's a light source right off camera. One of the last things I want to go over is light linking. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and hide all these lights. And I'm going to go ahead and add in, let's go ahead and take one of those lights actually. So I'll grab this background fill light. So I'll just go ahead and duplicate that and take it out of the group so we can see it again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it back. So light linking, if you can, if you're trying to control where lights are allowed to hit. So if you know, I want this to hit the background but not hit the character, but I need it to be kind of at this position so it gets the right shaping on my environment, right? So let's say I'm going to pull this up. Right? So let's say I want that shaping, I want that lighting on my environment, but I really don't want it to hit my characters that much or at all. Using a blocker is good, right? So I can come in here and I can add a Pixar blocker light filter, and I'm going to have to you know, play with the size a lot, and then also reconfigure this. Let's just pull this back. And again, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritties of doing this, and I'd probably have to restart IPR. But I could use this, you know, light blocker to kind of make it so it only hits these it doesn't hit these objects, right? And so you can see it's hitting that background more. Everything that's within this volume is being blocked off, right? So that's probably preferable, is as much as possible working with the tools that Maya has. Sometimes people will actually, if it's easy to do, you can just drop in something like a plane. And use that to kind of like as if you're holding up like a card in front of the light source to block the light. So let's go ahead and pull that up. And let's move it. Oh, it's in behind the light. And so I'm probably going to have to move it. Where is even the light? Oh, I'm behind the this is in front of the camera. Let's pull that up. So let's get this up to the light source. Okay, there we go. And we can still see this in the light, or in the camera, which is a problem. All right, so you could use like an actual geometry blocker if it makes sense. Probably a little less efficient than using one of the light blockers within Renderman. Another thing you can do, and this is kind of not necessarily a last approach, but something I wouldn't do. I would only do if you need to, because it's a little buggy, and it's not recommended. Is light linking. Not recommended by like professional lighters, as the ones I've talked to. So if you come into relationship editors, you do light linking. So I'd only do it if there's no other solution. So you can go into the relationship editor with light linking. So Windows, relationship editors, light linking, and I'm just going to do light centric, which means that I'm focusing on the light itself. So I'm going to select the light source, and I can choose what it is going to light. So let's go ahead and, by default, I just turn off all these ones, these shading groups. And so I'll come in here. Well, actually, I think I probably didn't even need to do that. So I'll turn it off on, oh, let's see, it's getting a little funky. So let me go ahead and restart IPR, because it's a little buggy, especially if you're, I know in the past when I've run IPR, light linking hasn't worked perfectly. So let's come back to this guy. So what I might do is I might want this to not light my character. So I'll go ahead and unselect the group with my character in them. You'll see now this light source is no longer affecting my character. I'd come in and I can grab Grandma's armchair, select that, and now you'll see that light source is no longer affecting Grandma's light armchair. So light linking can be really great compared to, like, this is a much simpler approach than the light blocker. And, you know, in the sense that I just have to select the objects it's not lighting. The only problem I have to keep in mind is that, or one thing you have to keep in mind with this is that, one, it's not very physically accurate or plausible, and two, it's something that's going to be prone to bugginess when you are referencing your projects, you know, moving them from one computer to another, same as a render farm. It tends to cause, light linking tends to like break or kind of ignore the rules you've set up in certain situations that you want them to. So that's another thing that you should keep in mind when using this tool. It can be really helpful, and I actually use this in my setup here to make it so I can get that background light without hitting the chair. But it is prone to messing up or interrupting at some point. So hopefully this video helps you guys understand approaching lighting in Renderman a little bit better. I know I didn't do like a full breakdown of how I constructed this. I just went through kind of the lights and how I set up lighting the scene. But hopefully showing you guys how to use Renderman lights, how to position things, the different tips and tricks and tools I use to kind of work a little bit faster in terms of, like, you know, placing the pivot point on the character, rotating around them, doing those blockers and those doing the light linking. Hopefully all that stuff can help you guys work a little bit faster and get better at this. The one thing I just want to reiterate that when you're lighting, you want to keep those three things in mind when you're working. And all these things are geared towards telling a story. So you want to set the mood and the location, the time of day with your lighting, right? So setting it as night, you know, this lighting source coming from off camera as a candle or some kind of lantern. You want to focus or direct the eye in the frame to what's important. So using value to make that background kind of fall back a little bit. Doesn't have to be dark, right? Not all of your scenes are going to have a dark environment, but we're using value to separate our character and what's important from the background. Add all the contrast, all the high contrast stuff on the character so that they separate and come forward, and we want to focus on them. And also using our lights to shape our objects nicely. Not every object needs nice shaping, like this background object here actually gets some pretty nice shaping, but a lot of these objects aren't getting shaping because they're not quite as important. But generally speaking, I want my objects to not feel super flat. I want them to feel kind of dimensional, especially on my characters and especially on my focus points. So we want to tell a story with our lighting, and so don't lose sight of that while you guys are working. And the very last thing I was going to say, sorry, one last thing is I added depth of field at the very end. This is something that do not keep this on while you're working because it's going to slow down your renders a lot. Let's come back to where the heck I am. Actually, let's go back. Let's kill that. And, oh, is this going to crash? There we go. And show all my other lights, and let's make sure I'm on the right file. There we go. And I'm probably going to have to re-IPR this. So if your changes aren't being visually obvious, then just make sure you guys restart IPR, because IPR doesn't always understand all of your changes. The last thing I did was I added depth of field. So you go View, select your camera that you're looking through. And I'm not going to show you guys how to, I think in another video when I talk about camera settings or working with 3D cameras, I talked about depth of field, so I'm not going to go in depth with it. So I come over here, scroll down to my depth of field tab, and click on depth of field to enable it. So you'll see my background starts to blur out, which is nice. And so we're getting that camera defocus or camera blur. Let's go ahead and delete all these extra renders so we can compare this a little bit better, right? So obviously my lighting is way different, right, we're getting that defocus as things that are getting away from our focal plane, which is our character, start to go out of focus, which adds a nice extra kind of like makes the things that aren't supposed to be in focus less important, right? Your eyes start to glide off them and focus on the character, right? So you can see this, he or she's in focus, and so we look at their face, right? And we don't look at the environment as much so that adds extra little helping in our composition and training our eye or focusing our eye on what we're supposed to look at. Don't use it too much, of course. But generally speaking, what we do is we turn on depth of field. The f-stop is going to be how much of our scene is going to go out of focus, or how much or how blurred out it's going to be, right? If I go ahead and drop it down to a really low f-stop, my environment's going to get really blurry, or my image is going to get really blurry except for the parts that are in focus. The focus distance is going to be how far away from the camera is the image in focus. And so this is a little tricky, because what I actually had to do is I ended up using a measuring tool, distance tool, to go from my camera to my character. And let's hold V to click on my character, and then let's just click on this plank right here, because I can't click on the actual environment, or the actual camera. So you'll see I measured the distance between my camera and my character, and that's what I set that focus distance to. It's 27. And it needs a little tweaking because it's not quite working. But if I didn't have that value right, and if I had it a little bit further than them, right, they go really out of focus, or if it's too close, that's like 5, right, character goes completely out of focus, and this f-stop's way too low. But generally speaking, that value, that distance, is really important for making sure that my character is in focus. So when you use depth of field, you do not want your character to be out of focus, because it's just going to ruin your image, and you're not going to keep everybody's attention on what's important. So that's the depth of field, but like I said, it's something you can add at the end, or when you're doing final renders, or even if you want to show it off to somebody. But while you're working, turn it off, because it slows down your render way too much, as do the volumes. So if you do the volume stuff too while you're working, it's a good idea to go ahead and hide them so your renders can go faster, and then add them back in whenever you're kind of wrapping up your work. Okay, so that's the last thing I wanted to talk about. Okay, just kidding. There's one more thing. And here, in image tool, there's something that can be really helpful. Let's go to my actual lighting that I was setting up. If I go into my image view, there is, I can look at different channels. So I can look at my red, green, blue. The only thing I really want to kind of show here is luminance. Looking at your image in black and white is a really great way of establishing if your lighting structure looks good, or if it's needs some work. Because once you get color in, especially like really saturated colors like reds and blues and yellows, and they're all really saturated, it can be a little hard to judge if your lighting's working. So switching over your channels to luminance is really handy for you to kind of like, and zooming this out is really great to see, like, is my lighting working? What do I focus on in this image, right? In this example, maybe the window, so I need to knock that back, but definitely my character's head and face is probably the most important part that I look at in the frame. And something I'm also noticing that I'm liking here is the area behind the head kind of becomes pretty flat and low contrast, which is really nice. But anyways, this is really great for diagnosing your scene and getting a good idea, is my value structure working well, or does it have problem areas? And once you're done doing that, you can just come back to channels and set that back to RGB to get your color back. And yeah, that's going to be officially it.